Look,
Every
there they
Friday for
are.
3 years, a rancher rode 12
Welcome
miles into
home,
town,
Martha.
paid
How
5
was the
cents for a
journey?
ticket he never used, and sat on the same bench watching every single passenger step off a train he never boarded. He wasn't confused, he wasn't lost. He was waiting for someone who was never, ever coming back. Kansas, 1885. Nobody in town asked him why. Not because they hadn't noticed, a man doesn't do that for 3 years without being noticed, but because some questions everybody understood weren't theirs to ask. Then a new ticket clerk moved to town with 2 fresh graves behind her and nothing ahead of her worth naming. And on the 5th rainy Friday, she did the one thing nobody else in 3 years had done. She walked out onto that platform and she asked him. By the end of the story, a bench worn smooth by grief is going to become something else entirely, but only after they both nearly lose the one place either of them had left to stand. Millbrook Junction, Kansas, 1885. The Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe line had run through town 4 years running, long enough for the platform to earn the particular character of a place used hard and kept up just enough. The cedar siding had weathered to gray. The rails held the day's heat long past sundown. When the Friday locomotive came through, a Baldwin 440 burning Kansas coal, smoke rolling back over the cars, it left the whole platform smelling of hot iron and creosote. A smell that settled into wool coats and didn't leave. Samuel Hargrove didn't seem to mind it. Every Friday, a few minutes before 4, he tied his horse at the post outside the station and bought a platform ticket, 5 cents. The standard fare the railway charged non-passengers to keep loiterers and cargo thieves off the loading area. He always had exact change. He wore his good shirt. Some Fridays, not on any schedule, he brought wildflowers, whatever was blooming along the south fence line on his ride into town, when it seemed right to bring them. He sat on the second bench from the east end. The 4:12 eastbound came in, and he watched every passenger step down, women in traveling clothes, men with cases. Families wrestling trunks and children, with the specific patience of a man who knows exactly which face he's looking for. When the last car pulled away, he sat a few minutes longer looking at the tracks until they curved around the hill and vanished. Then he put on his hat and rode home. Nobody in Millbrook Junction asked him about it. Not because nobody noticed. A man who buys a ticket every Friday for 3 years without boarding anything gets noticed, but because Samuel had ranched this county 15 years. 300 head on good land 12 miles south, and people knew him well enough to know the bench, the ticket, and the flowers weren't theirs to question. Clara Bennett had been behind the Millbrook Junction ticket window 6 weeks when she started paying real attention to him. She'd come from Emporia after burying both parents in one winter, her father in January, her mother in March. The grief from the 2 losses blurring into something she was still working out how to carry. She'd taken the position because it existed, and because being somewhere nobody knew her had seemed, at the time, easier than staying where everyone did. She sold tickets, logged arrivals, kept the schedule board current, and watched people come and go all day. She noticed the man on the second bench her first Friday on the job. By her 4th Friday, she knew his name from the ledger and had started watching for him without deciding to. He arrived at 3:52, bought his ticket with exact change. Thanked her without quite looking at her, the automatic courtesy people give clerks, sat on the bench, watched the eastbound arrive and empty, watched the tracks after it left, rode home. Then the 5th Friday brought rain. Samuel arrived at 3:52 in his good shirt, already soaking through, no flowers. The rain had started before he'd reached the fence line. He sat in it anyway. Watched the eastbound arrive and empty in it, sat his few minutes after looking at the wet tracks. Clara watched all of it from the window, then she made a decision. She closed the window, walked out onto the platform, and sat down beside him. "Who are you waiting for?" He didn't answer right away. She'd watched him 6 weeks by then, long enough to understand without being told that Samuel Hargrove was a man who weighed what he said before saying it, not from slowness, but because he understood words weren't neutral. He reached into his coat and drew out a platform ticket, not the one he'd bought that day, an old one, the paper gone soft at the folds from years of being carried. The kind of ticket kept as a talisman, not as proof of anything. He held it without handing it over. "My wife," he said. Clara waited. Her name was Charlotte. "When we first married, she went to nurse her mother in Newton 14 months. Every Friday she took the eastbound home to me for the weekend." He looked at the ticket. "I started meeting her here on this bench. The train ran late most days, and she said she could see me from the window before it even stopped. She always knew which bench because it was always the same one. When her mother died," Clara said, "she came home for good, but we kept coming. Friday afternoons, sitting here watching trains." He looked at the tracks. "She said it was the place she first understood somebody was waiting for her." He folded the ticket, put it away. "She died 3 years ago, fever, 12 days. He looked east. "I kept coming." Clara sat with him in the rain and looked at the wet platform boards, the cedar siding gone dark with water. She thought about what it cost to keep coming back to one bench, alone, week after week, year after year. "You know she won't be on the train," she said. "I know, then why?" He was quiet a long moment. "Because this is the last place I can still remember her running," he said. "She always ran the last stretch of platform, said walking was too slow after 3 hours on a train." A pause. "I can still see it here. I can't always see it at the ranch anymore." Clara pictured it, a woman running the last 20 yards toward a man on the second bench. And that same man returning 3 years running to stand inside the shape of that running. "I'm sorry," she said, not because it was the expected thing, but because she meant it completely. He nodded. They sat in the rain, then he put on his hat, walked to his horse, and rode home. Clara went back to the window and sat looking at the timetable board, thinking about a folded platform ticket carried in a coat pocket for 3 years, and what kind of faithfulness that required. The following Friday, she left a cup of coffee on the bench before he arrived, made on the little stove in the back room. After 4 days of deciding whether it was worth doing and concluding that small things either mattered or they didn't. Samuel arrived at 3:52, saw the coffee, glanced at the ticket window. She was helping a passenger and didn't look up. He sat, he drank it. When the train had come and gone and he'd sat his few minutes, he brought the cup back to the window. "Thank you, it gets cold waiting." "I guessed," she said, eyes on the schedule board. He held the cup a moment. "How'd you know how I take it?" "I guessed right then." He left. She carried the cup back to the stove and thought, no sugar. She'd guessed correctly the first time because she'd been paying enough attention to understand he wasn't a man who added sweetness to things that didn't need it. The coffee kept appearing every Friday. She didn't sit beside him again right away. She gave him the bench, the coffee, the platform. But by the third Friday of it, she noticed he stayed a few minutes longer after the train left, still looking at the tracks, but differently, less like waiting. More like remembering, which isn't the same thing. What she didn't know was what had shifted in him that week. 3 days earlier, his foreman had told him 40 head were showing the lung sickness moving through the county's herds, a consequence of the brutal winter building in from the north. The same cold about to devastate cattle ranges clear from Kansas up into Montana before it finished. Samuel had ridden the south pasture at dawn, counted what he stood to lose, and done the arithmetic of a man who'd carried a ranch alone 3 years and knew exactly where the margins sat. He'd come to the station that Friday carrying that arithmetic, and the coffee had been there, hot, made by someone who hadn't been asked. He drank it, sat, looked at the tracks, and for the first time in 3 years the tracks didn't feel like only an absence. They felt like a place where he was known. She never told him about her own Fridays, not from hiding it, but because her version of the same loneliness felt smaller next to his, and therefore not worth equal weight. She'd spent most of her adult life in her parents' house in Emporia. Her father's health had failed when she was 24, and by 33 both were gone. Leaving her standing in a house she suddenly understood, she'd organized her entire adult life around people no longer there to need her. She'd sold the house, taken the Millbrook Junction position because it existed. Every Friday she sold tickets to people going somewhere, watched them board trains, and went back to Mrs. Doyle's boarding house to eat supper alone. She was perfectly capable of doing that indefinitely. Capability, she'd learned, wasn't the same thing as being enough. Walking home one November evening with the wind cutting through her coat, she stopped on the boardwalk and looked at the street, a cattle town in transition, the big drives ending. Barbed wire and wheat changing the range faster than most ranchers wanted to admit, the feed store and blacksmith still busy, the hotel freshly painted. Life proceeding, her proceeding alongside it without quite being part of it. She was 33 years old and she had a bench and a man who came to it every Friday, and for the first time since her parents died, she had something on Friday afternoons to look forward to. The window she stood at all day wasn't only a window anymore. It was a specific vantage point from which she watched one specific person. And that fact frightened her and mattered to her in equal measure. She went asleep without resolving the contradiction. It started again in November, not because of rain this time, just because one Friday Samuel arrived and sat, and Clara finished with her window work early. Carried 2 cups out and sat beside him without ceremony. He didn't suggest she go back inside. They watched the eastbound arrive together, 3 passengers that week. Samuel watched each with the same patient attention. Then the train left and he looked at the tracks and she looked at them beside him. She was 26 when I met her, he said, here on this platform. She had too many bags and I helped her and she thanked me the way someone thanks you when they don't like needing help and are trying not to show it. He looked east. I thought about that the whole ride home. Did you come back the next Friday before you knew if she'd be on it? He almost smiled, slow the way his smiles came. Eventually she told me the most frightening thing about me was that I was the kind of man who showed up without a guarantee. He was quiet. She said she'd never had anyone show up for her like that before. Clara looked at the tracks and thought about what it meant to arrive week after week, before there was any reason to expect a particular outcome. She thought about her own life organized around other people's needs with little room left for showing up for possibilities, because the odds had always seemed too low to bother. Then she looked at Samuel and saw, for the first time, what she'd been avoiding seeing, a man sitting on a cold bench because a woman had once run toward him across this same platform. And because returning to the place that had happened was the most honest thing he knew how to do. They sat quiet thinking about the same thing without having agreed to. December brought 2 kinds of bad news and only one of them was about cattle. The lung sickness took 11 head from Samuel's south pasture before the hard freeze finally killed it off. He came to the station the first Friday of December with the look of a man who's absorbed a loss and isn't ready to discuss it, bought his ticket, sat on the bench, drank the coffee Clara had left. When she came out after the train, she sat beside him. Bad week, lost 11 to the sickness, he said. She'd been at the window long enough by then to know exactly what that cost a 300-head operation. She didn't minimize it. Will you make it through winter? Yes, it'll cost. But yes, they sat in the December cold. Down the platform, the station master was arguing with a freight handler over a misrouted crate. The second piece of news came the following week, and it was Clara who heard it first, not from a passenger, but from the station master himself. Reading aloud from a circular the railway had sent down the line. The Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe was consolidating its smaller stops. Millbrook Junction's traffic numbers had come in under the line the railway had drawn for keeping a stop open. If the spring numbers didn't improve, the station would close by autumn, folded into the larger depot at Hutchinson, 22 miles east. Clara read the circular twice before she told anyone. She thought about the ticket window that had become, without her quite noticing when, the only place she felt like herself. She thought about the bench. She told Samuel on a Friday in January, handing him his coffee with her hand not quite steady. They're talking about closing the line here, she said. If it happens, there's no platform, no bench. No Friday train to watch come in. He was quiet a long moment, looking at the tracks the way he always did, except this time she understood he wasn't looking at an absence. He was looking at something that might actually be taken from him a second time. Then I suppose, he finally said, we'd have less time than either of us thought. Neither of them said anything else about it that day. But something in the pace of their Fridays changed after that, less waiting, more arriving, as if both of them had quietly agreed the bench wouldn't be there forever. So whatever it was going to become, it had better become it soon. The letter from Hutchinson arrived in February, not about the station consolidation, but about Clara herself. The Hutchinson Junction Depot, a larger operation with a full staff and a permanent position, salary 30% better than Millbrook paid, recommended by someone she'd known back in Emporia. 3 weeks to respond. Clara read it twice. She thought about December and the accounts Samuel did alone at his kitchen table. She thought about a man who'd shown up on consecutive Fridays with no guarantee of anything. She thought about herself, who had decided against hoping because the odds always seemed too low, and who had been standing in the one place the opportunity actually was for 8 months running. There was a bitter irony in it. She didn't miss Hutchinson. The very town Millbrook's own line might soon be folded into anyway. Leaving now would just mean arriving at the ending early on her own terms instead of waiting to see if the station survived the year. She wrote back and accepted. She told no one. She worked her last 3 Fridays without saying a word, made the coffee, sat on the bench, listened to Samuel talk about the cattle and the spring calving and the accounts, and the laugh that had started showing up more often since November. She decided the laugh wasn't about her. It was easier to leave that way. On her last Thursday, she packed her bag. On her last Friday, she carried it to the station. Her plan was simple: close out her shift, buy her own ticket on the eastbound to Topeka, connect west from there to Hutchinson, and be gone before he arrived. Practical, the sensible thing. She was standing on the platform with her bag when she heard his horse come through the station gate. He was late, 3:58, not 3:52, 6 minutes. It shouldn't have mattered. He came through the door and stopped, looked at the bag, looked at her. Looked at the eastbound pulling in behind her, the Baldwin engine breathing its column of black smoke, the coal smell reaching them both. She hadn't planned for this. She'd planned for an empty platform, a clean exit, a train that carried her off before anyone could say anything that made the sensible decision harder. Samuel Hargrove stood 10 feet away, and the train was at the platform, and this was the part she hadn't planned for. He crossed to her, didn't say her name, didn't ask about the bag. Just looked at her with eyes that had been watching these tracks for 3 years, and she saw in them something she'd been choosing not to see for months. He'd been late because a fence needed attention on the south pasture. He'd almost not come at all that day. He'd come because it was Friday, and because Friday was what it was, and because somewhere in the last several months Friday had quietly stopped being only about Charlotte. Last boarding, the conductor called. "I took a position in Hutchinson," she said. "I should have told you." He looked at the train, looked at her bag, looked at her. "I spent 3 years waiting for a woman who couldn't come back," he said. "I don't want to spend the rest of my life missing one who could have stayed." The locomotive held steam at the platform. The conductor checked his watch. Clara stood with her bag in both hands and looked at this man who'd left wildflowers on a bench and bought a platform ticket every week for 3 years. Who'd shown up on consecutive Fridays with no guarantee, who had never once in 8 months asked her for anything she wasn't ready to give. She thought about the Hutchinson letter and the clean exit and the sensible decision. She thought about her mother's sickroom window, her father's window, every window she'd stood behind while life happened to other people. She thought about a woman running the last 20 yards of this exact platform because walking was too slow. She put down the bag. The conductor looked at the bag on the boards, looked at Samuel. Looked at Clara. He shrugged and called final boarding. The eastbound left without her. Spring came to the Kansas plains the way it always did, bluntly, after a winter that had meant it. Clara stayed. The Hutchinson position went to someone else. The Millbrook Junction window remained hers for now. The railway's spring traffic numbers, she'd later learn, came in just high enough to keep the consolidation talk quiet another year. Though nobody in town ever quite stopped watching the numbers after that. Mrs. Doyle offered no comment on the unpacked bag, which was Mrs. Doyle's particular way of approving of something. Samuel came by in April to ask if she'd like to see the ranch. She said yes before he finished the sentence. The ranch was everything 8 months of Friday conversations had led her to imagine, and more besides: solid, well-kept, a house built for more people than currently lived in it. He showed her the kitchen last. Charlotte had organized it, a particular logic to where things sat, what lived near what, which shelf held which necessity. Samuel hadn't changed any of it, not from an inability to, but from understanding the logic was sound and that some things you keep because they still work. Clara stood in the kitchen doorway. Then he took her out to the garden. Charlotte had planted it their first spring together, kitchen herbs along the south edge, something flowering along the north wall, and in the center, coming up now in the April light. The plants that returned every year on their own, because she'd chosen things that came back. Samuel stood beside Clara at the garden's edge and didn't say anything for a moment. She had good judgment, Clara finally said of the garden. About most things, he said. Clara looked at what was growing and thought about tending something someone else had started, not replacing it, not writing over it, but understanding it well enough to carry it forward correctly. That was its own kind of love, different from beginning something, not lesser for being different. I'd need to learn what she planted, Clara said, before I could help keep it going. I can tell you what I know, Samuel said. It's not all of it. That's all right, she said. We'll figure out the rest. They stood together in the April garden, the Kansas light on everything, and that was enough for that day. He went back to the bench one Friday in May, alone. Clara knew he was going. He'd told her simply the night before, and she'd said she'd see him after. He walked to the station, bought a platform ticket with exact change. Sat on the second bench from the east end. He'd brought wildflowers. The eastbound arrived at 4:12. Passengers stepped down, a man with a case, two women, a family with a child who ran ahead on the platform the way children run after sitting too long. Samuel watched each of them. The train left. He looked at the tracks going east until they curved around the hill and disappeared. He took the folded platform ticket from his pocket, 3 years of carrying it. The paper had gone soft at every crease. He held it a while. He thought about Charlotte, not the absence of her, which was what he'd been looking at for 3 years, but the presence of her, which was different and had been there the whole time. She was in the kitchen she'd organized and the garden she'd planted, and in the way he showed up without guarantee because she'd loved him for exactly that, and the loving had shaped him permanently. She was in everything he'd kept doing because of her. He set the wildflowers on the bench beside him, not the way you put something down, but the way you leave something in good hands. He sat a moment more, looking at the tracks. Then he put on his hat, stood, and walked to the ticket window where Clara was finishing her shift, and waited for her the way he'd always waited, at a specific place, at a specific time. Without reservation. She came out, she looked at the bench, she looked at him. Neither of them said anything about the flowers. They walked together through the Millbrook Junction evening, toward the life they were building, one with room in it for everything that had come before. Because that was the only honest way to build anything at all. They married in September on a Saturday because Friday belonged to the station and neither of them wanted to change what Friday was. The ceremony was simple, the Reverend, the town Mrs. Doyle in the third row, wearing the expression of a woman who'd watched something develop for 9 months and was thoroughly satisfied with the outcome. Clara wore a dress the color of the Kansas sky in September. Samuel wore his good shirt, the one he'd worn every Friday for 4 years running, and now on the Saturday he married. She noticed and said nothing because some things simply are what they are. After the ceremony, they walked to the station, no particular reason, no train to meet, nobody expected. They went because it was where everything had started. The platform sat empty in the September afternoon. The timetable board read the next eastbound at 6:14. The second bench from the east end held nothing now, no flowers, no folded ticket, just gray cedar boards worn smooth by years of use. Clara sat down on it. Samuel sat beside her. They looked at the tracks going east until they curved around the hill and disappeared. The coal smell from the afternoon train still hung faintly in the air. The iron rails caught the late light. Samuel, Clara said. Yes, I knew, she said, about you, that you'd show up even without a guarantee. I knew it from the beginning. He looked at the tracks. Yes, he said. She did too. Clara put her hand over his on the bench. He held it. The September afternoon settled around them, the light going gold, the tracks running east. The town of Millbrook Junction going about its business around a small station where a man had once sat on the same bench for 3 years. And a woman had finally asked the right question at the right time. The bench was theirs now, not instead of what it had been, in addition to it. A year to the week after their wedding, the railway sent a final circular down the line. Millbrook Junction's numbers had held. The consolidation was off the table for good. The station master read it aloud on a Friday afternoon to whoever happened to be on the platform, and Clara, no longer behind the ticket window by then, though she still came by most Fridays out of habit, felt something in her chest unclench that she hadn't fully realized was still holding tight. That evening she told Samuel over supper. He set down his fork and was quiet a moment, the way he got quiet before saying something he'd weighed carefully. "Good," he said. "Some places are worth keeping standing, whether or not anyone outside them understands why." They walked to the station that Friday evening the way they sometimes still did, no train to meet. The second bench sat empty in the low gold light, cedar boards worn smoother every year by the same weather and the same weight. Clara sat first. Samuel sat beside her, and after a moment, without any particular occasion for it, he took a small paper packet of wildflower seeds from his coat pocket, the kind Charlotte used to keep by the kitchen window every spring, and pressed it into Clara's palm. "For the garden," he said, "something new alongside what's already growing there." Clara closed her hand around it. She understood exactly what he meant and what he didn't need to say, that nothing about loving her had required unloving anyone who came before. And nothing about the years ahead required forgetting the years that built the ground they were standing on. The eastbound came through at 6:14, same as always, and they watched it arrive and empty and pull away, the way they had 100 Fridays before and would 100 more after. Not out of grief this time. Out of habit turned into ceremony, the same platform, the same bench, holding both everything that had been lost on it and everything that had, against every reasonable expectation, still managed to be found. Some places don't get to stay standing by accident. People choose to keep them. Samuel Hargrove and Clara Bennett chose theirs, one ordinary Friday at a time, for the rest of their lives.